can bones really tell a story? And can bones really tell the story about how one man killed 33 people?
We are here to tell you that it is very possible. Bones can tell you much more than most people think.
I'm Cassidy and this is Courtney. We will be telling you about the victims of John Wayne Gacy, and we will explain how the forensic anthropologists used bones of the victims to identify the bodies.
John Wayne Gacy was one of the most horrific killers this world has ever seen. He is known as the killer clown because that was his profession. Most of his victims worked and lived with him.
He raped and killed 33 boys and buried them under his house. Gacy was a successful businessman in Chicago and he was well liked. No one ever thought he could be a serial killer.
And that is where this investigation starts.
His first assault was committed on May 22, 1978. This was one of the few boys he did not kill, but the crime was the same. He lured his victim, Jeffrey Ringgold, into his car by offering him a joint. Shortly after getting into Gacy's car, Gacy drugged him with chloroform. Then he brought Ringgold to his house where he viciously raped and tortured him. Ringgold later woke up in Chicago's Lincoln Park. Ringgold is considered one of his lucky victims.
The first piece of evidence that led the police to Gacy was his car. He had let one of the boys use this car because at the time he was working for him. But this boy was seen in this car a couple days before he was reported missing. This car was again seen, but another boy was driving the car. He told the police that his boss, John Wayne Gacy, could explain why he had the car.
This later led them to get in a search warrant for his house where they found the bones and the other pieces of evidence they were looking for, like the chloroform.
The first task of the forensic anthropologist was to separate the bones because Gacy had all the bones on top of each other from different bodies.
The first thing the forensic anthropologist could identify from these bones was that the average victim was a teenager in the early 20s. They were also Caucasian males.
The way the forensic anthropologist would have figured out the age was by using the pelvis, femur, and the humerus.
The pelvis would have shown that the pubis bone, ilium, and ischium would have been fully ossified or turned into bone with no evidence of the long bone being separated by cartilage. The femur would have shown that the condyles, the end of the long bone, first joined the shaft.
Lastly, they would have seen the humerus's upper epiphysis united with the shaft. All of these clues would have led the forensic anthropologist to believe that the boys were all around 20 years old.
But that wasn't the only thing that was concluded from studying the bones. They were also able to determine that all the boys were Caucasian. They used the skull and femur to determine the race.
The first thing they would need to do is determine the nasal width and the nasal height. Then, for a body to be determined to be Caucasian, their nasal index needs to be greater than 0.44 millimeters. Also, you would need to come to the conclusion that the nasal spine is a prominent spine, and then the nasal guttering is a sharp ridge. Another factor is the prognathism. The bone under the lower jaw is straight. Lastly, the shape of the orbital openings are usually rounded and somewhat square.
If their fingers can fit under the curvature of the femur, then the final race determination would be Caucasian.
Another trait that would have been determined by the bones would have been the gender. They used the pelvis and the skull to determine the gender. The traits they used from the pelvis is the subpubic angle, the pubis body width, the greater sciatic notch, and the pelvic cavity shape.
The traits they used from the skull are the upper edge of the eye orbit, the shape of the eye orbit, the zygomatic process, the nostril crest, the bony protrusion in the jaw, the frontal bone, the mandible shape, and the ramus of the mandible.
Then they needed to identify the bodies so they could be returned to their families, and a big part of this was using their teeth and comparing them to the dental records.
The next step was to examine the skulls. By using modeling clay on the skulls, you could see what the nose and cheeks could have possibly looked like. And they used fake eyes and wigs with the approximate hair color to take photos of the bodies so they could be identified by their friends and family.
But even with all these ways to identify the boys, 9 boys were still not identified. There was also one boy, Michael Marino, that was wrongly identified as one of the boys.
Through the ways already described, the investigators really thought this boy's name was Michael Marino. But through taking a closer look at the bones by using an X-ray machine, this victim had previously broken collarbone. But Michael had never broken his collarbone, and they could tell that this collarbone was broken before the crime was committed.
John Wayne Gacy was found guilty and he was sentenced to life for the 33 murders he committed.